Hi, I'm Malika Bilal, and you're in the stream. Today, Singapore's internet shaming. Is it the social media version of public caning? Our guest digital producer, Omar Badar, is here looking out for your live feedback. And Omar, I know there's a lot.
There's definitely a lot of feedback on public shaming. Some people actually just find it to be useful free speech that, gives feedback on what's happening in society, but other people actually do find it destructive. But interestingly, we put out the question of what sort of things actually could end you up on a public shaming website in Singapore.
I'm afraid to hear some of those answers.
I know, it's actually quite interesting. One person's take here, TV Miller, lists dangerous driving, obesity, disregard, littering, absence of etiquette, promiscuity, and ignorance.
Well, that's a lot of things on that list.
Just about everything, essentially.
Okay.
But we also put out the question of whether public shaming could ever be a good idea. And Guna says, no, it is too intrusive of someone's personal decision-making and is definitely not for people on the internet to judge. On the other hand, Gerald says that he would upload a photo of public shaming to send caution to people and the rest so they can put up their best behavior. Of course, what do you think at home? We want to know, so be sure to tweet in and be part of this conversation using the hashtag AJStream.
Looking forward to those thoughts. And there are so many ways to share your comments with us. Now, one of those is Google+. Just add the stream to your circle, and you too could be in the stream.
I'm Hamza Shaban, I'm a freelance writer, and I'm in the stream.
It's a sign of the social media times. You can't walk down the sidewalk these days without the potential that someone is watching you. These public paparazzi are ready to snap your picture with their cell phone the moment you step out of their social norm. And where do those photos end up? Facebook, Twitter, or internet shaming sites like Singapore's Stomp. Some say internet shaming has gotten so bad there that people are calling for the government to shut it down.
Do you know why I hate being in Singapore? Stomp. People like stomp here, stomp there, stomp there. But you know what? Just want to say, Stomp has no life.
But not everyone shares his sentiment. Many say this type of citizen journalism is simply free speech. Others argue the trend is leading to harassment and increased xenophobia in Singapore. Well, here to discuss this via Skype, we have Anita Kapoor, a travel and lifestyle television host in Singapore. Also in Singapore, Justin Fong, a social media consultant. In Bristol, England, Nazri Bahrawi, lecturer at Singapore University of Technology and Design. And in Sydney, Oliver Woods, former resident of Singapore. Welcome everyone to the stream. Now we want to start off by noting that we invited Stomp, Singapore's Media Development Authority, and the Ministry of Information to join us. All three organizations declined to participate. So Omar, I want to start the conversation with you in the community. I know that we're hearing from our tweeps in Singapore, and they're sharing things with us.
They're actually sharing even examples of what this public shaming looks like. If you take a look at my screen, Lynn here says, no Stomp discussion is complete without this report, which takes the cake or the sandwich. Take a look at this. This is from Stomp's website. It says, schoolgirl gobbles sandwich on bus and friend doesn't bother to tell her to stop. So this is what qualifies for public shaming. Sometimes it's not quite so trivial. It's slightly less trivial, like this example here that says traffic officer breaks traffic regulations by riding on pavement. So Anita, I want to start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about what this public shaming phenomena and why websites like Stomp are so popular in Singapore?
Thanks very much. I mean, I'd first like to start off by saying that I actually straddle both sides of the equation as a public face who also has opinions. So I think I'm very much in the stream for public shaming at any given time. But having said that, I think, what I said earlier in the pre-show is the fact that we have so much of it right now. First of all, Singapore is an extremely connected country. Secondly, I think all of this online activity is sort of a reflection of a rapidly changing Singapore. There's a healthy disdain for all this overt order, and I think there's a bit of strengthening of a burgeoning sense of self. And I think that forms the basis for why a lot of people are on the internet and saying what they do and doing what they do.
Anita, there are, of course, people online who aren't happy with people saying what they say and doing what they do. And so I pulled up on my screen here. This is a change.org petition. This is a petition against Stomp. the site. You see here, it's got 22,611 supporters have already signed this petition as of right now. Why is there a backlash?
I think personally, I mean, my personal opinion is that the reason that Stomp in particular has a backlash is its affiliation with Singapore Press Holdings. You know, we have a media that's very, very much monopolized. Apart from that, though, I think Stomp has never really been ever slapped on the wrist. It's been allowed to run free. It's created this type of online journalism that is petty, racist, bigoted, sexist. Not that that's any different from anything that's happening in the world, but there seems to be also very much, and I think Nazri said this earlier actually, about the fact that it's also about labels. We're absolutely obsessed with labels in Singapore, and Stomp seems to be very much a reflection of those labels.
So Justin, do you agree with that? And is this backlash justified?
Excuse me. I think in a sense why Stomp is facing such a backlash is because it's affiliated to the mainstream media. Stomp is owned by ST, Straits Times. They're actually the main newspaper in Singapore. So whenever people relate or they think about Stomp and they think about the Straits Times, they have a high expectations for accuracy in the news. So whenever there's something that's proven to be, I would say made up or going against, being deliberate to cause certain unhappiness or certain problems in Singapore, naturally people will feel unhappy towards Stomp.
Justin, do you ever worry about being stomped or shamed online?
To be frank, no, because I believe that at the end of the day, if you are conscious about how you project your image in public, and if you do nothing wrong, then there's really nothing to be afraid of.
So Oliver, I saw you nodding your head as Anita was talking, and what are your thoughts on this?
Look, I think the elephant in the room and what's been referenced earlier about Stomp being owned by Singapore Press Holdings, and the elephant in the room is that Singapore Press Holdings is not only functionally a state-owned organisation. Like in Singapore, it kind of straddles a weird place in between private and state-owned. But what's really important to know is that the Straits Times, which owns Stomp, is viewed as a government mouthpiece, and I think the one thing that defines the strange relationship and how strange Stomp is that it is actually functionally a state-owned website. And I think that very few other countries would tolerate such behavior by a state-run website. And I think in many other countries, as there is in Singapore today, there'd be a large clamoring for the government to move out of this kind of irresponsible public shaming journalism.
So we have people here weighing in online specifically on that particular point. Tara says state-funded media shouldn't be running public shaming sites in the first place, especially ones that post libelous and xenophobic content. But on the question of whether public shaming can ever be used in a good way, Lynn says only when the pictures are so powerful enough to be a catalyst for social change. She gave the example of the maid who was forced on a ledge to clean windows. She goes on to say, but the problem is when the focus is on the most trivial antisocial behaviors that Stomp has, examples, public displays of affection and snacking on a bus. And finally, Nicholas says, it started off as citizen journalism. It would have been great if people posted on things that mattered to them. So, Anita, do you think instead of calling for Stomp to be shut down, that maybe there's a way to reform the website so that it is focusing on stuff that actually matters to people more?
I think there's always a way, to reform websites like this, but it just hasn't been done. And I think the other point I actually just wanted to make while we were having this discussion, what we were saying earlier, is that we speak about this entity as if it is a beast that isn't being fed. But the beast is actually being fed by citizens. So I think it makes us all very uncomfortable as well, because this does give us a reflection of what some of our citizenry actually think. To try to shut it down or close it off or whatever, I think is really immaterial. It is a very petty site. Perhaps if there was something that could actually challenge this site, and I think good competition is what we actually lack in the media here.
That's an interesting point. I've heard a lot of criticism about the government. The government has responded, at least to the petition. I pulled up on my screen here. This is from the Media Development Authority on their Facebook page. They wrote, "You may be aware of an ongoing petition to shut down Stomp. While it is not for the Media Development Authority to influence the editorial slant of sites, we would, as the media regulator of Singapore, take firm action if any internet content provider is in breach of the Internet Code of Practice. So Nasri, I want your thoughts on what you think of that statement, and do you think that Stomp and other sites like it, because others have mentioned that Stomp is not the only site, are they in breach of this Internet Code of Practice?
Yeah, the idea of the Internet Code of Practice is really something quite interesting. It has developed over the past 2 to 3 years, and you know, it's you have to understand the media landscape and the social media landscape of how Singapore operates. A few other websites have have appeared since Stomp came out, and these are these are couched as independent sites. So what we really need to see, Anita earlier talked about competition. There are competition of sites coming up. The question is, are these providing really a political spectrum of what's really out there? From what I gather, what's happening is that Stomp detracts the attention away from social political issues, and on the one hand you've got mainstream media that are thought to be government controlled, and on the other hand we have independent media that are thought to be anti-establishment. But I think there is a whole range of political spectrum that needs to be covered, and I haven't seen a blog or some other alternative to Stomp that can fill up this spectrum.
Well, I want to give us the flip side here. This is one of the tweets that Omar, you mentioned a little bit earlier, and someone's referencing a story about maids cleaning high windows, and there were several deaths a couple years ago. So this is an article that was tweeted to us earlier today on Asia One. Tell maids not to clean the outside of windows. There are pictures there of women cleaning windows on high ledges. These were posted on sites, including Stomp, and the government came out and said to stop this practice. So one could argue that this is a positive aspect to something being posted online and there being a public outcry about it. Anita?
I agree. I agree that there's two sides. First of all, this term public shaming, I think it's taken on a life of its own, and it's almost as if it's an acceptable term. First, I don't think it's at all acceptable to shame anybody publicly, but to draw attention to things and to write it in a particularly responsible way is, I think, what we're really trying to aim for. But when you think about Singapore as a country, I mean, I think we've only really found our voice maybe in the last 10 years. Feel free to argue, rest of the panel, but it's almost like we're teenagers acting out, and we act out online. We don't really have a lot of other outlets in which we can act out, and online is the place. To come back to what you've just said, yes, I think that there are positives to drawing attention, but the act of actually shaming people, there can never be really, I think, necessarily a positive outcome. Something like, for example, posting pictures of the helpers who are doing these things. Yes, absolutely. It draws attention to something. Does it actually change the practice? I'm not so sure. And I think a lot of people have an issue with the fact that you have these sites and you have these other sites. You have places like TRS, which is absolutely vile as well. Yep. You have another site called the Hardware Zone. It's actually a forum. And my question often is this, is that I'm curious as to why it's just Stomp that's getting all of this attention. And I believe that it's because of its connection with SPH. But there are plenty of other sites that do the exact same thing. They draw attention to minor disputes and issues, basically for the eyeballs and the click-through.
So, Nazir, we have a couple of people here commenting online about the social aspect of this. We have Bliss here online who says, how about tapping people on the shoulder and just saying, hey, that's not a good thing to do before public shaming? And we have Fred also who follows up on a similar sentiment saying, this seems very passive-aggressive. A combination of politely talking with people directly about etiquette and practicing tolerance would be more effective. So my question to you, Nazri, is why do you don't think that this sort of thing actually happens more directly? I mean, is it that people are just uncomfortable with directly confronting people in public, or do people actually enjoy sort of the social media public shaming that actually takes place?
Yeah, I just want to just jump on to answer that question as well. Jump on what Anita said earlier. Really, Stomp is and we should view it as a form of technology to enable something in a society. And of course, in a Singaporean society, we see Stomp enabling what could have been good, like how we have addressed it earlier. But also, we've seen it enable this culture of public shaming that has come out. And like you said earlier, I think that my reading of Storm is that it could have gone. It started with a very benign. It started as a benign idea, but it has now went on into something quite monstrous, you know, and that aspect of its monstrosity is overtaking its benign purposes, and for that reason, I think the petition has got validity, right? But there is also we have to be careful about talking about the positive. Is it positive for us to be telling on others? Because this is really what Storm is trying to do, to create a culture of what can be considered a panopticon, right? Where everybody watches everybody else, and you're always looking over your shoulder to see.
But couldn't it also be an instance of a culture keeping each other in check? Justin, I want to know whether or not you agree with that.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to add on to the point that Anita talked about where she brought in the issue of hardware zone, TRS, and so on. My view of why these websites are not bearing the brunt of any anger is because everybody knows that these websites are actually very negative or very anti-government. So whatever they say, the public in general or the readers who look at it always take it with a pinch of salt. The issue with Stomp is that, like I mentioned earlier, they have this so-called allure of being a state-run newspaper or media platform. Therefore, people have certain expectations of what sort of stories come from it. So as I was sharing with some friends the other day, the only one way that Stomp can actually get around this is to actually qualify that these articles being published are being published by citizen journalists and they're not being verified by Stomp.
But I have to disagree with Justin there. These are not. This is not citizen journalism, right? Because journalism entails some sense of responsibility, some check and balance. But you know, with what's happening in Storm, there is really very little check and balance. Of course, citizens are putting pictures on it, but they're not really exercising a kind of the ethics of journalism.
Right, and people online are saying that what's missing is this checks and balances aspect. But Oliver, I see you want to talk. I want to go to you actually with this, because one of the striking things we've seen that I pulled up on my screen here is that several of the headlines look like this. They use the word foreign. This one says, another case of foreign women quarreling on public transport, this time over a train seat. So that aspect of foreigners doing these things, is there an aspect of xenophobia to this?
Totally. And look, I think just one thing to really contextualize this whole discussion for international viewers who aren't familiar with Singapore. Singapore is ranked 150 out of about 200 countries in the World Press Freedom Index. It's alongside Russia, Iraq, Gambia, Azerbaijan, and Belarus. So I think to talk about Singapore as if Stomp is this, as if there's a free media, really is not the right way of even thinking about the Singapore media landscape. And I think the racism inherent in Stomp, in my mind, to some degree, is some form. It functions as an outlet as a legitimate outlet of some frustration with the government's current immigration policies, where they're bringing in large numbers of foreign workers. Though in recent years that's changed a lot. But yeah, I think Stomp tolerates racism in a way that very few other government-run websites anywhere else.
I have to disagree with Justin there. I don't think it's racism so much as it is racialism, in a sense that it is about strict categorization rather than really an honest way and a way to try to look at someone else in a very in a racist kind of way. But what I'm trying to say is that because Singapore is so used to strict categories of race, class, and gender, it tries to put people in this side, into these boxes. And so what Storm does is to enable that. And so it doesn't come out so much as being racist, as trying to look down on certain people, but trying to put them into their place. So to me, that's more dangerous than racism. And the reason why I say it's dangerous is because it operates on a very sublime level rather than a very open level where you can call it out.
So let's make this conversation. I'll come to you in just actually, I want to direct this question to you, but let's make it a little bit more personal and direct. So we put out the question of whether people would ever consider posting these public shaming images themselves. Akas here says it depends on the nature and severity. If the behavior was structurally oppressive, examples sexist, racist, etc., then yes. And then we have Emna here who says, I would describe the behavior, maybe post pictures, but not identify those who have committed the acts themselves, because it doesn't really matter. So Anita, Can you imagine any circumstances under which you might actually participate in something like this directly yourself?
9 out of 10 times no, but I'd like to cite the recent case of Anton Casey, the gentleman who pretty much got drummed out of Singapore, and because he produced a video that made mention of the fact that he needed to get rid of the stink of public transport, and then I'm sure you've all heard of it. And I think I actually shared that on because it was actually a really quite vile and quite disgusting way of talking about a country. Another incident was when we had a local singer who got bashed in the face by a guy at a taxi stand because she called him out on being a bit of an idiot. Both those occasions I actually did share. 9 out of 10 times I would not share, but I believe in actually sharing, not shaming. Sharing, and I think there's a very big difference in what you attach to it, and telling people and spreading a word about something that might be quite a horrific act or a negative. The pettiness, though, I want to go back to the ideas that we were talking about earlier, not ideas, but the actual fact of pettiness. I think what we have is a very pressure cooker society right now in Singapore, and there is a great level of pettiness here right now towards others. There's a lot of reverse racism or racialism. It's a little bit like having a massive chip on your shoulder and not really knowing what to do with it. Now, I love Singapore. I've lived here since I was 7 years old. I'm a Singaporean. And my observation is that we're struggling a lot with our own identity. Our government has opened the doors. We've got lots and lots of different people in here. But people feel that they are not being heard. And I think some of that actually drives a lot of this online hate. It's online shaming. You asked earlier in the program for a lot of it.
Of course, could serve as a platform, though, to be heard.
I think everything is a platform where you can actually be heard. What is it that you're actually trying to say?
There, of course, then lies the question. Nasri, I want to bring you in here because we've heard several criticisms about Singapore, but from the outside looking in, there are low crime rates, low murder rates, relatively high health indicators, positive indicators of what life is like in Singapore. Are these everyday aggressions that some may think are minor, are they actually contributing to social cohesion, checks and balances, as we heard earlier? Is that helping these positive indicators of Singaporean society?
Yeah, I do think that, when we're talking about Stomp here, we're really talking about the site. We're not really talking about a society as a whole, because, any society has many different facets to them. And yeah, Singapore has earned a reputation of being economically pragmatic and all those positive things that you've said. But we have to also think about Singapore moving from third world to first world. That very famous phrase that's always repeated in such a short time, in one generation. So my grandfather lived in kind of Singapore backwater, and I'm living in a first world Singapore, right? And so as we develop in such a fast pace, I think what have not developed is a kind of social, a sense of civic and social consciousness. And now, like Anita, I think mentioned or gestured to earlier, we're seeing, in the past, in a very short time, a lot of that coming out online and coming out offline too. And so we have to see Singapore in this context. It's not a phenomenon that tries to put Singaporean into a kind of xenophobic lots. They're not xenophobic, just like any other society. It's just a reaction to what's going on. But I don't want to downplay also the kind of tension that's there, because I think it's really important to talk about it and to call it out.
Well, yeah, I agree with you 100% on that. Sorry to interrupt.
No, of course.
I just want to agree with you 100% on that. I think what we actually don't have is we don't have those forums to address race. We don't have the forums to address the things where we can openly, face-to-face, talk to one another. So social media then becomes the medium through which people talk. And like with any conversation, there are always going to be people who will just jump right into it with both feet and just say things that they wouldn't ordinarily say. And I think the other thing is that social media, Twitter, Facebook, and everything else, it emboldens people. It makes people feel like they are invincible.
And of course, it gives you that anonymity. Of course, I see everyone wanting to get in here, but we're going to have to end the conversation there and finish this in our online post show coming up next at stream.aljazeera.com. Now on the next show, Fimio K is back to discuss gender flipping. taking photos and videos of women and recasting them with men. Why some say the meme is challenging everyday sexism. Until then, we'll see you online. Welcome back to the Stream's online post show. We've been discussing internet public shaming in Singapore and whether or not it provokes harassment and xenophobia in the country. Now, before we entered the post show, Anita was mentioning that there aren't a lot of forums for people to address some of the social issues in the country. And Justin wanted to get in on this conversation. Justin, what did you want to say?
No, actually, what I was going to add on was that actually, like you all mentioned, the anonymity portion is there, where you can post things and have some being anonymous about it. Actually allows people to say things that they normally feel or they wouldn't normally say in public. But what I'm trying to say was that it seems like the belief is that this so-called xenophobia is something new. I don't think it's new. It's always been there. It's said that just that it's been suppressed and no one actually spoke about it for many years. Yeah.
Definitely.
And
I think that race.
And Oliver, go ahead, Oliver, and then we'll go to Anita.
Sorry, no. I was just going to say that I think that's exactly right. I mean, we can't blame Stomp for xenophobia and racism, and in a way, it's the way Stomp is structured. I think that conversation before we had about racialism is accurate, and that Stomp, I guess, technically isn't racist. But look, I think really simply going back to one of my earlier points. I think one of the cures for xenophobia and racism online is having a much freer media. Because one of the things I think people in Singapore feel very frustrated and some people feel very angry about, particularly where they vent on Stomp, is because there are a few other places they can do it beyond their own personal social networks. And if Singapore liberalizes its media landscape and allows more websites, more local news websites to set up, and more organic citizen journalism, I think that would be a great cure to the problems that Stomp has today, and it may well encourage Stomp to behave a little better as well.
Well, Anita, picking up on what Oliver is saying there, what's stopping someone from going out and starting their own media organization?
I think a lot of people have actually gone out and started up new blogs and this and that, but I think there's also there are also issues and problems with actually registering these things, what they're considered, what they are, what they aren't. And this, I think, just basically confuses the whole thing. You either want some level of free speech or you don't. And I think we're straddling this at the moment, and it's a kind of a difficult thing, it seems to be, especially at a government level, because I think they've always kind of been on the back foot when it comes to social media. And it was only in the last election that they caught up to it. And even then they were actually on the back foot, and they realized that they needed to interact and engage with a whole different landscape. At the same time, I think that the control and the monopolization, I'm not so sure if I'm allowed to say this on Al Jazeera, but I think it just pisses people off. People are annoyed, they're angry, they're not being heard, they don't have outlets. When they want outlets, then there are lots of different types of red tape that are put in their way.
And Anita, that is okay to say because we're on the internet. So speaking of the internet, what are people tweeting us, Omar?
We're actually raising some bigger concerns about broader societal implications of this kind of public shaming. We have Oregano and Olive Oil, love the name by the way, who says, when does public shaming turn and become instigation for other forms of abuse? And we also have Akash who says, shaming people in this manner may also raise privacy issues. People will fear deviating from accepted norms, and that will kill diversity. Nazri, do you share those concerns about this killing diversity in Singapore and whether it could lead to actually more direct forms of abuse towards people?
Yeah, I just want to contextualize that debate also in terms of what Singapore has been used to in the social sphere. And so we are very used to this idea of what is called an Asian values, right? A set of Asian values. And part of that Asian values mindset is to try to have to embrace community over self. And again, I would like to bring this back to the idea of strict categorization, because I think that's really an issue that belies Stomp, that idea that we are all in boxes and we can only stay in those boxes, right? And so because of this strict categorization, people don't want to go out. The idea of the community is a very big idea in Singapore. We have the Malay community, the Chinese community, the gay community, the Muslim community. And so these how much do you sacrifice yourself for your community? And so this is what's happening here.
Oliver, I saw you nodding your head.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that as Singapore develops, and look, I love Singapore, and I don't want anyone to take my criticism of the media landscape as criticism of Singapore, because I think that's one thing in Singapore that's often, criticism of the government is often taken as criticism of the nation. But I definitely think that once Singapore breaks out of this idea that people fit into these boxes, for instance, in Singapore, I'm known as an Ang Mo, which means red fur in the local Hokkien dialect. Ang Mo means a white foreigner. Many people will first see me as an Ang Mo in the street, and I'll be called an Ang Mo frequently in a way that would be totally inappropriate in the United States or in the UK, calling someone by the color of their skin as a kind of speaking directly to me. And I think once Singapore, can move beyond that, and as Anita was saying before, in terms of Singapore's growing identity, I think, looking at sites like Stomp, if there are more opportunities for people to come out and talk about positive experiences online, not just shaming people, and talking about positive experiences, interactions with, like, for instance, as the previous commenter was saying, the gay community or the foreigner community, I just hope that we can start sharing more positive stories as opposed to shaming. So it'd be nice to see some more positivity in the Singaporean social media space.
Absolutely.
Justin?
I think it's also about this whole
Go ahead, Anita.
sensationalist. Sorry, I think it's also about this whole idea that, anything to do with the media now is just sensationalist. It's all about the headline that you put out on Twitter and how you just keep bombarding people with the same sort of information over and over again. And I think, why wouldn't we be affected in Singapore by that whole sensationalism of everything? But at the end of the day, I think what people really want and need is that they need openness, and they need a certain sense of freedom and space in which to speak openly. And yes, I think, yes, we're changing, but for many of us, perhaps this change isn't actually happening fast enough, or rather it is a kind of a manufactured change.
Well, speaking of those spaces to be online, I pulled up this graphic here. This is from stats from January 2014, earlier this year. Internet penetration in Singapore is 73%. Justin, what does this say?
Well, actually, I've seen other figures that show that internet penetration is more than 100%. The figures go by the number of accounts, or number of telephones or handphone subscriptions people have, and some figures I've seen say it goes up to 150%, which means every Singaporean has 1.5 handphones.
So then, basically, is this a natural progression of things? Is this something that can be expected?
Yes, I believe it's so, and I think as the conversation is going, I begin to realize to accept that what Singapore is going through, the social media challenges that we are facing, is not only in Singapore. I believe every country out there is facing the same, but what actually accentuates the problem is that because Singapore is multiracial, and every single comment about a particular race or particular type of people actually has a lot of sensitivity. So that's why I think we're sensing a lot of frustrations, or a lot of backlash, and resulting in the petition for Stomp to be closed down.
So we have Timur here who says that essentially the public shaming was used about a year ago to raise awareness about corrupt politicians, and this was one of the positive uses of it, but says it is not the way to go with regular people. But I also have Deedon here who disagrees and actually finds public shaming quite useful. He says, when a person thinks that he or she can live the life one pleases, it is unethical in many cases. Exposing such in pictures would make them stop. So bravo, guys. And on that particular note, Oliver, can you think of, do you feel like you have modified your behavior when you were visiting Singapore because of fear of possibly ending up on one of these sites?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, some of the examples that have been shared earlier, and if you go onto Stomp and type in Angmoh, ANGMOH, you can find all sorts of lovely xenophobic stories about white people acting crazy in Singapore and then acting as representatives of my white community, whatever that is. But look, I mean, I think a specific example that I can share is an acquaintance of mine who is white. He's from Europe. He was with his Singaporean Chinese girlfriend. And I think they were being, I think they shared a kiss, or nothing too particularly amorous, but they shared a moment of intimacy on the Singapore subway on the MRT system, and someone was trying to. He noticed that someone behind them was trying to film them, Earlier on in Stomp's life, there were a lot of stories about how, portraying foreigners as kind of snatching local women. There was quite a common theme earlier on in Stomp's life, and particularly male foreigners snatching local women. And he turned around to the guy behind him trying to video the conversation on his phone and said, "What are you doing?" And then more people actually started to video the guy confronting him. So it's almost
did it
like
end up online?
He said, I don't think so. I don't think it did. But we talked about it afterwards. How it's kind of like it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, because he turned around to confront the person who was filming him, which I think is totally inappropriate. But more people started filming him, and you can just imagine how Stomp would spin that. If you're familiar with Stomp, they would say "Angmo attacks" on a Singaporean just going about his business.
Absolutely.
You can just imagine the title.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
Oliver, you've got people agreeing with you, and I'm going to have to Google that, actually, see if it did make it online. Now, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this discussion here. I learned a lot, so thank you for joining us. But of course, the conversation never stops. You can follow us at stream.aljazeera.com for more. Just use the hashtag AJStream on Twitter. Thanks to our guests, Anita Kapoor, Justin Fong, Nazir Bahrawi, and Oliver Woods. And a special thanks to our digital producer, Omar Madar. Now on the next show, Pimmy OK is back to discuss gender flipping, taking photos and videos of women and reshooting them with men, why some say it's challenging everyday sexism. Until then, we'll see you online.